Hello, thank you for joining the John Howard Association this evening for our second virtual annual meeting. I'm Jenny Volin-Katz, the Executive Director of JHA. I miss not seeing you all in person and the energy that fills the room at our annual event, but I do appreciate that not only does a virtual event keep more people healthy, it also allows more people from outside the immediate area to join us and hear our wonderful speakers and panelists. I'm pleased that even as COVID-19 impacts our lives, we're still able to bring people together to reflect on, discuss, and share our common commitment to improving the lives of people in prison and making our system more fair and humane. Of special note this year, it is JHA's 120th anniversary. For well over a century, JHA has been monitoring the prisons in Illinois in order to increase transparency and use the realities and lived experiences of people in prison to inform stakeholders and the public about the issues and problems inside our prisons and drive needed change. Thank you to everyone who supported JHA in so many ways over the past 120 years. We're so grateful to our staff, board members, present and past, volunteers, partners, supporters, and donors. In March of this year, JHA was able to resume our prison visits. In the past 7 months, we've been inside 13 facilities and issued several reports, statements, data analyses, communications updates, and policy papers. The importance of being back inside the prisons to observe conditions and speak directly with people who are incarcerated cannot be overstated. It is difficult to fathom the levels of isolation and deprivation people in prison experience during the pandemic. The problems and issues plaguing people in prison increased and intensified. From lack of medical care, communication with loved ones, programming and movement inside facilities, to hugely reduced product availability through prison commissaries, making it difficult for people in prison to get basic hygiene items and cleaning supplies. Not to mention the constant fear of living in the most dangerous environment possible during the pandemic, surrounded by people who often did not take seriously the protocols put in place to reduce the likelihood of exposure and contagion of this disease. I think it's fair to say there's been nowhere more frightening, dangerous, and awful to be for the last year and a half than prison. Since the onset of the pandemic, JHA's work to find out how people in prison are doing and fighting for increased transparency has been on overdrive. When we couldn't go into the facilities, we were reaching out to people, fielding emails, calls, and letters, conducting a system-wide survey, documenting what we learned through these communications, and sharing the concerns with IDOC, pushing the department for data and making information publicly available. Our concerns about what is happening inside prisons are not only focused on COVID. Like the larger world, people in prison are also facing a long overdue reckoning of racial injustice in this country. Our criminal justice system, which was built on systemic and pervasive racism, must confront and change the reality of how and why people in this country are punished, which is largely based on the color of their skin. The work and mission of fighting for humane treatment for people who are incarcerated and increasing transparency remains both difficult and important. JHA is pushing ever harder to create and expand sightlines and access into prisons as circumstances make them more difficult to access. What happens inside prisons matters. The people in prison matter. Public awareness of what happens inside prisons matters. And that is why we continue the difficult, sometimes unacclaimed, but critically important work of independent citizen correctional oversight. For 120 years, JHA has been going into Illinois prisons to monitor the conditions of confinement, talk to the people who are incarcerated, in order to bring their voices and experiences out to the public and into reform efforts. JHA will continue to fight for people in prison to be treated with dignity and respect, and we will continue our work to achieve a system that is fair, just, and humane. Our work in this event would not be possible without the generous support of so many of you. In particular, I want to recognize and thank the following sponsors: our anonymous host level sponsor, our Diamond Anniversary level sponsors, the Bloom Family Charitable Foundation and Project 111, our Platinum sponsors, Rick Artwick, Paul and Sarah Jane Titterton, and GATX Corporation, as well as all of our other sponsors and individual donors. Pleased to introduce our first speaker, who is United States Senator Dick Durbin. Senator Durbin is the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee and has actively worked to make our community safer and promote justice both in Illinois and across the nation. Senator Durbin has been a leader in introducing and fighting for important reforms that give people a second chance after incarceration and in championing the effort to increase and improve transparency inside federal prisons. Senator Durbin, thank you for being part of our annual event.
Dick Durbin here. Thanks for inviting me to your annual event. You know, we didn't plan on having these events virtually, but that's what we have to do now, at least for a little while longer. But we ought to reflect for a little bit on the 120 years of hard work of your organization. When this pandemic began, many of us feared that our nation's prisons were headed for disaster. At times during the pandemic, the infection rate among federal prison population was 6 times higher than in the communities that they were located in. More than 240 federal prisoners died from COVID-19. Many of those deaths were preventable. The John Howard Association has fought tirelessly for safer conditions in prison, and you were one of the first to call on the prisons when they failed to rehabilitate incarcerated people in a safe manner. A famous writer once wrote, "The degree of civilization in a society can be judged by entering its prisons." We can and must do better as Americans to improve the conditions of our prisons. As we come out of this pandemic, vigilant oversight will be needed more than ever. I worked across the aisle to pass the bipartisan First Step Act to help inmates successfully return to society, and we must ensure that those reforms are fully implemented. I'll soon be introducing a bill to ensure holistic oversight of our federal prisons. I know the John Howard Association can be counted on to offer valuable input. Your voice has always been a critical part of the conversation on improving prison conditions. Thanks for continuing to be part of the fight for a humane prison system. Keep up your invaluable work.
Thank you, Senator Durbin, for your dedication to justice, support of JHA, and commitment to fighting for reform. Every year, JHA honors leaders, citizens, advocates, partners in the work, and others for their commitment to justice in support of our mission. I'm pleased to announce this year's award winners. For his leadership and efforts in passing transformative criminal justice reform legislation, JHA would like to present our Legislator of the Year Award to Illinois Senator Robert Peters. Senator Peters, thank you for your dedication and commitment to improving the criminal legal system and recognizing the humanity of the people who are impacted by it. JHA appreciates the tremendous work you accomplished this past year and looks forward to supporting your ongoing efforts to improve the system and the lives of people impacted by it. JHA would like to present the 2021 Changemaker of the Year Award to Representative Justin Slaughter. Representative Slaughter has worked on system reform issues for many years, including his leadership this year in passing the SAFETY Act, a sweeping reform package that addressed many difficult and longstanding system failures. Representative Slaughter has continued to fight to change the criminal justice system in myriad ways to make it more fair, humane, and effective. We thank him for his tremendous efforts and look forward to continuing to both supporting and working with him to further system change. Next, I'd like to present the Volunteer of the Year Award to Daniel Goring. Daniel began volunteering with JHA in 2017, and over the years has pitched in to assist with projects big and small. Not only has Daniel continued his service to JHA through the pandemic, this past spring, Daniel stepped up to provide significant assistance with JHA's prison communication work while our prison communications manager was out on maternity leave. Daniel, we're so grateful for your ongoing commitment to JHA and the many important contributions you make to our work. I'd like to present the Award for Excellence in Criminal Justice Reporting to Shannon Heffernan from WBEZ. Shannon's reporting has earned her many awards, including a Third Coast International Audio Festival Award, a National Murrow Award, and a Prindy for Best Writing, as well as awards from the Illinois AP and Chicago Headline Club. This award from JHA recognizes Shannon's dedication to thorough and accurate reporting of criminal justice and prison system issues. Shannon demonstrates unrelenting diligence and commitment to gathering all relevant information and data, bringing in-depth analysis to the issues, and including multiple sources in her pieces, including the voices of those who often go unheard. JHA thanks Shannon for her important work, helping to expose the dysfunction and inhumanity deeply embedded in our criminal, legal, and prison systems. Please join me in congratulating all of JHA's 2021 award winners. We appreciate their dedication and contributions to furthering reform. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize the service and dedication of 3 outgoing JHA board members. Boz Kniphorst served on the board for 3 years. He was on the executive committee as a vice president and assisted JHA with prison visits, communications, and marketing initiatives. Pete Seneschal served on the board for 10 years and was on the executive committee as the board secretary. Pete was deeply involved with JHA's policy work and helped guide some of our organization's efforts in this area. And Joe Vasicki served on the board for 19 years and is a past board president. Joe held several different roles on the board, went on many prison visits with us, and has long been a trusted advisor and supporter of the organization. JHA deeply appreciates Boz, Pete, and Joe for their commitment and support. We're extremely grateful for all that they've each done to help JHA advance our mission. Next, it's my privilege to introduce an extraordinary woman, Bernida McWhite, who works at North Lawndale Employment Network, Ready, Chicago. Bernida is a formerly incarcerated person, and she's decided to share her story in order to open people's eyes, hearts, and minds to the realities of life in prison. She's a dedicated advocate who uses her experience, time, and talents to fight for reform and improve the conditions of treatment women in prison face. We're honored to host Bernida this evening and so grateful for her as a champion in the fight for system change.
Good afternoon. I am Bernida McWhite. It's a pleasure being with you today. I am here to tell my story and my journey from being incarcerated and now being a returning citizen. When I entered prison during the intake process, I was looking for undergarments that would fit. I also was dealing with thyroid issues that caused me to have a lot of facial hair. During the transition from Cook County into prison, you don't get those necessities like a razor or things that women may need. So when I got to intake to get the basic needs, the officers began to refer to me as the bearded lady. They really strip you of all of your humanity side. You don't feel human. They feel like you don't deserve an explanation for any question that you may ask. During this time, it was really hard for me to sleep. This was my first experience. And I did ask for something to help me sleep at night. Once again, they gave me the medication, didn't tell me the pros and cons to the medication. I just knew that I wanted to be able to sleep. I found out I was eligible for a work release, but every time the names were called, I didn't hear my name. So I went to a counselor and I asked the counselor, when I got here, you told me that I was on the list for work release. Why am I being passed up? Her response was, oh, they didn't tell you? Once you come into the Illinois Department of Corrections, if you have ever seen a psych doctor at Cook County or received any type of antidepressant medication or anything like that, you're marked, which means you may be eligible for house arrest, but this can house arrest or work release, but this can hold you back. I said an additional 8 months because when I was asked to be removed from the medication, they sent me through assessment after assessment to find out that I really didn't need the medication. That required me to stay much longer than I needed to. I also witnessed an inmate die in my cell. When you enter prison and you have a lot of addiction going on, these young women come into the prison system, no assistance is offered to help them detox. This young lady was in my cell. She screamed all night long. No one came to see what was wrong, to check on her. About 4 a.m, she finally was quiet and went to sleep. I woke up that next morning to wake up for breakfast. She wasn't breathing. When officers did come, they just remove the body. Not one time, after many requests, I couldn't even see a counselor or anybody. No type of counseling or therapy was offered to me. That was so traumatizing to me. That vision still sticks with me today. This mass incarceration is a big factor into broken homes that we're dealing with now. We have our men who are in prison for petty crimes, and some of them are sitting in jail due to the fact that they can't even afford the bail. But when you have a facility that's holding a lot of women with children, and a lot of these young women are not violent offenders, there was no alternative offered versus prison. You get to a prison and you find out that you can't even see your family because there's no transportation between Chicago and Decatur. Really, really affected me because I had a mom who was on her deathbed, my only son, and we're not privileged or anything like that. So to find a way to come see me was pretty much impossible. So the mass incarceration that's going on, it has a domino effect to the foundation of a household. There's a lack of proper health care too, and this is my personal experience. When I was in prison, healthcare was not what it should be. I found out after coming home that the actual doctor that we were being seen by was actually a veterinarian. There's no way that anyone should be okay with that. That should make you want to act and speak out for equality. Because returning citizens, we're people too, and we have feelings, and we deserve the best, just like everybody else. So if my story can help anyone, I would really like everyone to join together to help this cause to end mass incarceration. Not let people like myself feel lost or alone when we're incarcerated because we feel like we don't have a voice. I'm only one voice, but I'm speaking for those who are still battling all of those barriers from being in prison. Thank you all for this opportunity. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Bernida, for your honesty and courage in sharing those incredibly painful experiences with us. Hearing what you endured in prison opens people's eyes to the grim realities and everyday traumas experienced inside prison. It's people like you and stories like the ones you just shared that underscore why oversight of prisons is so important. We must find ways to witness and expose the realities that impact the lives, safety, and well-being of people who are incarcerated. JHA is so grateful to you, Bernida, for sharing your voice and having the courage to fight for change. Next, we will hear from JHA board member Joni Stallman. More than almost anyone else in Illinois, Joni has a holistic and complete understanding of the prison system and the impact it has on people. Joni was an administrator with the Illinois Department of Corrections for over 22 years. After that, she became the director of programs at St. Leonard's Ministries, where she worked to help people leaving prison reenter society successfully. She's an incredible resource to the field as well as to JHA.
My name is Joni Stallman, and I'm a member of the John Howard Association Board of Directors. I joined John Howard's board in 2018 because I know how important it is to have an outside organization monitoring the prison system. Why do I know this? Because I worked for the Illinois Department of Corrections for over 22 years. During my time there, I saw it all, the good and the bad. I saw many successes, such as the ending of death row, the closure of TAM's Correctional Center, which was a facility designed to keep people in isolation. And I saw people with long sentences going home. But I also saw how cruel and dangerous the system can be, the violence, the lockdowns, intimidation tactics, segregation, mental illness, and trauma. Working in corrections is difficult. What got to me most was the breakdown of the human spirit that I saw and the lack of compassion shown to people who were incarcerated. I don't believe you can deal with people who are struggling without having compassion. Prison is a horrible place to live. I don't care if you're doing 1 year or you're doing 40. You lose contact with your family. You live in an environment with no control, and people give up on you. I believe we can do better as a society. People living in prison are not throwaways. They're human beings who should be afforded their dignity and have their rights respected. They deserve common decency and opportunities to grow and learn, appropriate treatment, and safety. I always strive to be kind. If I could provide a comment or something to bring people along an extra day, then that was worth it to me. I knew John Howard Association well when I worked for the Illinois Department of Corrections. I'll be the first to admit I didn't always appreciate the John Howard visits or the request. Sometimes the visits required extra work that I did not have, but I do remember that the John Howard staff were always showing compassion. They asked good questions that needed to be asked. They fought for changes that helped not only the people living in prison, but also those of us working there. They helped bring about changes, big and small. Organizations like the John Howard Association make a difference, even if their contribution only leads to a small improvement or has the result of bringing something to the IDOC's attention. Any incremental positive change to treat people with common decency is needed and appreciated. And that's what the John Howard Association does. John Howard Association staff visit prisons. They observe what's happening. They listen to the concerns and the opinions of people who live and work there, and they fight for change. The John Howard Association pushes to make the prison system fair, more humane, to give people dignity, to provide people the tools to learn and grow and be ready for a second chance when they are released. This year marks 120 years that the John Howard Association has been operating. For 120 years, John Howard Association has used its monitoring work to shine a light in the dark corners of the Illinois prison system. John Howard Association allows the voices of thousands of incarcerated individuals to be heard to ensure that decision makers, stakeholders, and the public know what is actually happening behind prison walls. This matters more now than ever. COVID-19 has made this a difficult time for all of us, which means that life behind prison walls is worse and more dangerous than it was before this pandemic. Finding out what is happening inside our prisons has always been important, but is critical during this crisis. Would you please show your compassion by donating to the John Howard Association online right now? Your donation will ensure that the John Howard Association can continue to monitor Illinois prisons, listen to thousands of incarcerated people, and to advocate for meaningful change. After I left the Illinois Department of Corrections, I continued to work with people impacted by the prison system. I worked with people who were formerly incarcerated, helping them to re-enter society successfully. It's been amazing to see people who I knew 20, 30 years ago behind prison walls who are now out doing well and moving forward in their lives. To see them succeed, to be a part of their journey, and to hear them say, "I'm glad you're here, for you are always nice to me," means the world to me. I stay involved with the John Howard Association because I want to be part of something which can be helpful to those who are incarcerated. I've seen it firsthand. John Howard Association work truly makes a difference for those who are incarcerated. I love helping to make that happen. And so can you. So please donate to the John Howard Association today. Every dollar you donate makes a difference to us. You can make your donation right now on our website and know that your gift will make a difference to thousands of men, women, and youth incarcerated in Illinois or impacted by having a loved one in prison. Thank you for your commitment to prison reform, for your support to the John Howard Association. Together, we can improve the prison system and the lives of people caught in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joni, for sharing your experience and insights with us, and for your continued dedication to changing the system and improving the lives of people in prison. Your unique combination of corrections experience and commitment to recognizing and supporting the humanity of all people improves lives and helps drive JHA's work and mission. Now we're going to turn to our keynote panel conversation for this evening. Title of our conversation is Prison Oversight, Important Every Day, Critical During a Crisis. First, I'd like to welcome and introduce our three panelists. I'd like to introduce Marlon Chamberlain. Marlon brings over 20 years of lived and professional experience to his work as an advocate and reformer. He's currently the manager for Fully Free, the campaign to end permanent punishments in Illinois at Heartland Alliance. Previously, he served as the Englewood project manager with the Ready Chicago program, was a community organizer with the Force, Fighting to Overcome Records and Create Equality initiative. He's a founding member of the Restoring Rights and Opportunities Coalition of Illinois, chairs the Live Free Decarceration Advisory Committee, and he's an alumni of Just Leadership. Next, we have Kathy Bankhead. Kathy was the first independent juvenile ombudsman for the Department of Juvenile Justice in the state of Illinois, a position she held from August 2015 until July 2021. In that role, she worked to safeguard the rights of youth committed to state custody. As the ombudsperson, she made recommendations for improvements in the services and treatment of youth and used restorative justice peacemaking circles to meet and build relationships with youth committed to DJJ. She consistently advocated for a restorative philosophy throughout DJJ and the community. Prior to her appointment as ombudsperson, she served as an assistant state's attorney in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office for 25 years. From 2004 to 2009, she was chief of the Juvenile Justice Bureau. And last, we have Scott Semple. Scott joined the Connecticut Department of Correction as a frontline correction officer in 1988. During his 30-year tenure with the department, he served the agency in numerous capacities, including as a pre-service training coordinator in external and legislative affairs and warden of the state's only correctional facility dedicated for men requiring comprehensive treatment services for significant mental illness. Scott was appointed commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Correction in 2015. As commissioner, Scott successfully implemented several performance-based and progressive correctional practices designed to support both staff and incarcerated people. Notably, these include the emerging adult units known as the True Unit and the Worth Unit. Welcome, and thank you all for being here. We are so glad to have you join us tonight. Tonight's keynote panel conversation is about what prison oversight is, what it can do, what it cannot do, and whether it can be used as a lever for reform and change, and if so, how. As we get started with this conversation, I want to ground them in four basic principles that really guide and define John Howard's work. And those principles are: number one, humane treatment and living conditions for everyone, including people in prison; transparency. We believe that it's critical that the public knows what actually happens inside closed systems. Number three, accountability. In order to hold government systems accountable, we must be able to observe their behavior and have knowledge of their conduct, both that which is expected and actual. And change. We believe that change is needed and should be grounded in the current realities inside our prisons. So bearing those principles in mind and that theme, I would love to get started. First, I'd love to hear from you, Kathy, about your experience as the first ombudsman over DJJ here in Illinois.
So the first thing I did, because I didn't actually know what an ombudsperson did, was read the statute. The fortunate thing for me is the statute for the ombudsperson for DJJ is very broad and gives a lot of opportunity to pretty much go anywhere inside any system. as a restorative justice advocate, it was important to me, first thing, to meet the young people that I was serving. And so there were at the time 6 facilities that were still open, including Kiwani, which closed during the first 2 years that I was ombudsperson. So I went to every facility and I met in circle with young people, between 8 young people and 16, depending on how big the facility was and how late in the day it was. If it was getting pretty late, I had only 16 kids left to talk to, then I would talk to all 16 in circle. But it was a way for me to develop relationship with them, so that they would know or come to know that they could trust the ombudsperson's office to act in their interest. The things I focused on from the statute was, first and foremost, the statute said to assist young people and their families in any way that the ombudsperson could see they needed assistance. So that was, I took a micro view of this opportunity to help young people. The second was to look to see how systemic issues were impacting them. And third was to investigate their complaints and report them out, and to prepare, while I'm doing that, to create the annual report that ultimately becomes public at the end of the year.
Scott, I would love to get your input as someone who led a correctional agency. I know that in Connecticut, there had been an ombudsman from sometime in the 1970s until 2010, so before your tenure as commissioner. And I wonder what you saw as sort of the benefits and some of the issues perhaps with having an ombudsman or having oversight inside the prison system in Connecticut.
Thank you for the question, Jennifer. And here's what I would offer. I recall when we did have ombudsman services in Connecticut, and more recently, just through the media, there was an intention to bring those ombudsman services back. When you think of oversight, I also kind of put that on the same scale as a partnership or a collaboration, because in many cases, the work of an ombudsman can identify trends that are happening within facilities and agencies. And I think that part of the work with the ombudsman is to be very transparent in terms of problem solving, to allow for a mechanism for that ombudsman to be involved in trying to determine what needs to be done to kind of direct the resources to address whatever pervasive issues that may be happening within a correctional system. And I have to say that Kathy had me at hello because I'm a big fan of restorative justice principles, and especially as it applies to the use of circles, which was used for our emerging adult populations when we established the True and Worth units in Connecticut. But all in all, I think there is a place in systems throughout the country for ombudsman services, and we have to have a way that we can evaluate it from an analytical perspective to see what the trends could be or are within the systems themselves.
Marlon, I want to ask you, as someone who's experienced incarceration and is an expert in community organizing, especially around system change, where do you see oversight positioned in terms of ability to drive change?
So I would simply say checks and balances. And I think oversight provides an opportunity for trust to be built. And I would use a couple different examples. So I would say that people who are currently incarcerated, there's a grievance process. But in most cases, people would complain about the grievance process because they didn't feel that their grievance was heard or that it reached the right person that could help resolve the conflict or the tension or whatever it was that exists. And so I think when you create these oversight bodies, then there's a separate entity that could review the grievance and really sort of help like bring the outcome or the result that all parties are looking for, which is a peaceful, hopefully a peaceful outcome.
So I'm interested in kind of exploring that theme, where trust and relationships come in order to really enhance transparency and accountability.
one of the ways that trust is built is just by sort of aligning missions, right? So my conversation with staff members who often saw the ombudsperson's office as an enemy was that, yeah, it can't be an enemy because we're all on the same side. We're all here to make sure that young people who have been in conflict with the law get the resources, services, and opportunities they need so that when they go home, that they won't continue to be in conflict with the law, that they'll be able to live free and happy and grow up to be responsible, respectful adults. And so if that, right, so that these children are not here for me to be employed, right? So same thing with the staff. These children are not here for you to be employed. These children are here because they need help, and our employment is to help them. So we're on the same side. Once that is stated, right, you can only be an enemy to me if you're not on these kids' side. And if you're not on these kids' side, then that makes you, then that makes that, hopefully that clicks in that person's mind that, well, yeah, maybe I need to get on their side. And what I found out over the course of years was a lot of the staff then would, for example, come to us and tell us things or steer us to see things that we might have missed because they did feel like they were on the kids' side, that was their mission and that was our mission, and that if we work together, it would be better for everybody.
Yep, I would just add, just to piggyback off of what Kathleen said, I also just think about how, when I think about the culture, and I think about this culture of us against them, and I think you have to push past the rhetoric of the us against them to say, to what Kathleen said, how do we align like the mission and the values of what we want to see? And I think when you add that entity that could provide oversight, it's not to say that every grievance is 100% accurate, but what it does say is that somehow conflict has arisen. And what it gives you is an opportunity, going back to the restorative justice piece, it gives you an opportunity to resolve the conflict, because sometimes there is conflict amongst individuals who are incarcerated. And what happens as a result of the mistrust is that if I'm in prison and somebody steals my TV, instead of me going to this entity to say, can you help me resolve this? The culture says you have to react and respond. And because I don't trust the grievance process, or because I don't trust the COs, I'm going to take matters into my own hands, which could be me sort of creating or now resulting to violence, because I don't have an entity that I trust, or I don't have a relationship with someone that I can say, hey, someone went into my cell and took my TV. What can I do to get my TV back? Which is really the outcome that you're looking for. But sometimes in carceral systems, the culture is you have to respond. And if you don't have these bodies that could help mediate conflict, then you're going to have violence. And it's the same on the street. So I think even as we talk about trust, it's about trust from all aspects. It's about the COs trusting that this body is not out to get them. And it's also about the individuals who are incarcerated, knowing that this, if I go to Kathleen, it's no nonsense. So if I'm lying and I know that what I'm reporting didn't happen, that we're going to get to the bottom of what happened and resolve the issue. And I think right now, because we don't have these entities or these bodies in place that act as like this separate entity, we see the outcome, which in a lot of cases is violence, or you see even the correctional officers where they have this no snitch rule just as much as the community do, because that's the culture that's been created.
I was going to try to put a correctional perspective on this. We were speaking with regard to the staff, and it's really more of a story, but what Kathy and Marlon said reminded me of, as you indicated during the introductions, I worked over 30 years in this field, and it took me more than 20 years to recognize something that's very important, and it is a good example of the things that we, as Marlon said, take for granted. When I became deputy commissioner of the agency, so this is somewhere, I don't know, 26 years into my career, 27 years into my career, it was the first time that I started to, I was a warden, then I'm deputy commissioner. I get invited to these outside events. And there's this one particular event, and I was a newly appointed deputy commissioner, and it was at the Housatonic Community College located in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And it was a celebration for formerly incarcerated folks who have been out of the system for more than 2 years and have moved on and succeeded in their lives. And that night when I was driving home, it was an epiphany for me, because it was the first time I was like, I've been doing this for so long. And that's the first time that I've ever seen success. Post-incarceration, successful people never saw what success looked like. And if I'm a deputy commissioner, what do my staff see, right? The only thing they see is what comes into the system and what returns to the system, right? And they kind of categorize that under the umbrella of failure. It doesn't matter to them what type of engagement I have. They're just coming back. The only thing that I see is failure. So when I became commissioner, I began this process of connecting with formerly incarcerated folks, right? Running in the interest of transparency. This is where I want to go. This is the strategic plan of what I want to introduce. I need your insight. And I learned some very interesting things, right? I was one of those guys that talked a lot about best practices and evidence-based programming and all that other stuff. Well, guess what? The consumer, formerly incarcerated, successful people said that, hey, we appreciate all that stuff, but it's not about that. It's about engagement. It's about relationship with not only incarcerated people, not only correctional staff that were able to influence them, but also their peers, right? So if you think about that from a common sense perspective, and I use this example a lot, Jennifer, and I think you've heard it before. I don't remember anything I learned in 5th grade, but I remember Mr. Mobilio because he loved me, right? And he was able to influence me. And he was able to influence people in the classroom. In correctional systems, if you engage appropriately with the client, with the consumer, you could influence change. Despite everything else that you do, it really comes down to relationship and trust building.
I want to kind of zoom us out now. We've been talking a lot about ombudsman and grievance systems and focused more on individuals. And I want to talk a little bit more macro, kind of big picture. So, some of what we do at John Howard is going into facilities and doing more monitoring or inspection, right? And we're there we don't act as individual advocates. We take information in from individuals. We assess it. We look for trends. We spot issues. We go into the facilities and look around, checking on things that are global, that impact everybody in the facility: air quality, water quality, ventilation, finding out about, general conditions and the treatment people are receiving and things of that nature. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, how that kind of fits into the equation of both building trust and also how it fits into some of the reform efforts, because I think it is a harder fit sometimes into the reform efforts. People seem to it seems to be easier to talk about individual situations and problems and get agreement on them to move forward. I find that when we talk about them at the systems level, it's more challenging. And I wonder, first of all, what everybody else's experience is with that, and also where you see the connections and I guess some of the barriers to forming those connections and moving the work forward. as being?
I think that a macro agency like the John Howard Association is critical to the work of the Ombudsperson's office. Because of the Ombudsperson's office, we use the micro to build, to see the macro, right? If we're getting complaints around the department from young people about the same thing, we know that there's a systemic issue. If we get the same complaints from young people in a facility about the same thing, we know that there's a systemic issue. Systemic issues that run department-wide or systemic issues that run individual facility-wide. When there's another organization that's looking at the big picture, and the big picture that they're seeing is consistent with the macro and systemic issues that we're seeing, not only does it help us check ourselves to make sure that sort of the information that we believe we're actually getting, but also as we are contacting advocates, reform agencies, talking to legislators, talking to the department about what we're seeing, they're also getting this second wave of information, or this other consistent wave of information that, one, makes both parties' information more reliable, i.e. trustworthy, and two, more likely to get more people involved, and then that involvement can drive change. At least that's how I see it and experienced it.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, and would just add, I think part of the challenge from what I've seen from a systems perspective, and I always use the recidivism number as an example. What if the recidivism percentage really was a reflection on the system and not individuals? And I think whenever we begin to point out the flaws of the system, I would go back to what we initially started talking about around culture, and the culture and the conditions that we create. And I think the work that that John Howard does is imperative, it's important, it's needed, because I think what I see is that whenever we're persistent in pointing out sort of like the data or statistics of what we're learning, like in most case scenarios, it becomes unavoidable, where you have to acknowledge like what's happening. And to me, I think that is a start. Just even acknowledging that there are prison systems that are inhumane and that people should not be in them. I think you laid this out in the beginning, Jenny. Transparency, accountability. I think when we begin to continue to point out these flaws in the system, that at some point, especially when you begin to engage the community and system stakeholders, then you can begin to acknowledge the harm that's been done and then begin to talk about solutions. And so I would say that, yes, the work is hard, but it's needed. And I would also say that I think over the last few years, we're thinking about how do we incorporate directly impacted individuals in these conversations to sort of help validate what's happening, but also have representation from stakeholders to say like, hey, like we do have people who are in alignment, and we can begin to build from that place versus the us versus them mentality where things stay the same. We continue to yell at each other, but then we don't have these opportunities where we can begin to engage and work so that ultimately what we want is these systems that really promote growth and forgiveness and restoration. That's what we want, because in most cases, people are coming home. And we want to make sure that we're preparing people to come out and to succeed and not to go back to prison.
I'll just add, as someone who is a director of a system, and has to think a lot at the macro level, generally directors, commissioners, whatever you call them, they're influencers, right? They're presumed to be effective leaders, and folks that are really good at it and do it in a very humble way really focus more on empowerment, and that means that you could walk people through kind of a macro level issue, and empowerment means that you're going to accept nuances in order to get to where you want to be, right? So I'll go back and I'll use the emerging adult concept that Jennifer spoke of earlier in my bio. That was a kind of an interesting journey because from the outside and advocacy, they were asking a lot about, well, what is the recidivism rate of people who have participated in this program? And recidivism in the formula as it's applied in Connecticut takes about 3 years to make some determination. And they were asking me 6 months into the program. And then what do you do with that, whatever that recidivism number may be? And how do you compare it to other jurisdictions around the country? Because everybody has a different formula, right? So I've even used other formulas from other systems and applied it to Connecticut and was able to look at a recidivism number much lower than what we were purporting based on the formula that we use. So I kind of walked away from the recidivism discussion and I began the process of evaluating harm, right? So a lot of people come into the system have already experienced trauma. A lot of people, that's inclusive of staff, and a lot of people that are in the system who live and work there get exposed to trauma on any given day. So if somebody comes back from a program that gets a lot of notoriety and arguably the True Unit and Worth Unit have, I'm interested to know why they came back, right? So we didn't pick cupcakes for these units. We picked people who were problematic, impulsive, have assaulted others. If we pick cupcakes, we wouldn't get the true understanding if this thing worked or not. And so a lot of these folks had come in on victim related offenses, right? And if they come back, I want to know, did they come back for the same reasons, or was it something that was less harmful, right? So to me, that is what success looks like. You know, someone could come back and for whatever reason it may be, but is it for the same reason that got them there in the first place, especially if it's associated with these victim-related offenses? So, yeah, on the macro side of things, that's all great, and there's a lot of nuances that you have to take into consideration. It's not just the hierarchy of the executive team and the managerial force, coupled with the frontline staff and the advocacy and incarcerated people and all that other stuff. When you're talking about culture, you're talking about leadership that impacts culture. Well, then you also need to talk about cultural leaders, and that's inclusive of all of those things that I just brought up that work within a closed environment as it was portrayed. You need to be able to understand who the leaders are in that environment, and it not necessarily people who walk around with a gold badge on.
The other value of an organization like the John Howard Association is that for every other closed system except for juvenile, there is no other oversight. The adult prison population doesn't have an ombudsman, and neither do the detention centers, the juvenile detention centers in Illinois, or the jails for that matter. And so, and in fact, our office, would refer young people to the John Howard Association to tell them about some of the things that were occurring so that they could look at it from the long view as they were doing their work. And so the fact of the importance of oversight just cannot be overstated, cannot.
So I want to pick up on the theme of harm reduction that's been mentioned in this conversation. And one of the things that I think is being discussed more and more is, do short-term harm reduction strategies, and I put some of our monitoring work in that category, do they undercut or how do they impact long-term system change efforts? I'm interested in how you guys see those things supporting each other or contradicting each other.
What we don't have is we don't have language that really expresses the notions of humanity, right? As applied to humans. When I hear the word humane or inhumane, I always think about animals. But that's the language that we use to talk about how people should be treated, basically how vulnerable people should be treated, how people who are not privileged should be treated. Every time I walked into a particular facility, I didn't get that same feeling I got the first time I walked in. It looked normal now. And I worry about the emotional, psychological, and moral toll that working in that environment has on people. So if we think about the Stanford experiment, even though that was a little extreme as compared to today. And so honestly, when I think about the abolitionist movement, I wonder myself whether there can be enough reform that people who are vulnerable are not abused by people who lose their humanity. See, when we talk about the words, we apply them to the people who are vulnerable. If I can just use the George Floyd example for a minute, where people talked about the officer not seeing his humanity. Well, that's not what I saw. Clearly, George Floyd was abundantly human, and many of us identified with him. It caused an entire reckoning, a reckoning in this country, right? As people had to have identified with him to feel the way that they felt afterwards. The issue of humanity was the officers. But we don't even have a way to talk about that. And to the extent that we don't have a way to talk about that, I don't know that we have a real way of reforming this system, these systems, such that they do not cause more harm. And so I'm going to borrow something from Richard Pryor now also, honestly, some people, probably need a timeout to, get some stuff together, get some help getting some things together. And so the idea of not having any place is probably not a thing that I necessarily support, but I do believe that the way we do corrections and who winds up in corrections and how many people wind up in corrections definitely could use some abolition.
Yeah, and once again, I agree wholeheartedly, and this is a conversation that I've had on several occasions, and I remember talking to somebody who was formerly incarcerated as well, and we were talking about the reformists versus abolitionists, and he said something that was true, and we both sort of laughed about it, but it wasn't funny. And what he said is that people who are yelling that they're abolitionists, he asked the question, have you ever been to prison? Because, and the reason why he brought that up was because he said, there are people that I was incarcerated with that I'm afraid for them to be in my community. And when I thought about what he said, there were also people that I've seen while I was incarcerated that I would be very concerned about them coming back to the community. That's not to say that if we send people to prison, then there should be some sort of like rehabilitation opportunity that people can take to change, because I do believe that everyone can change. I do believe that. But I think to Kathleen's point, like, I think we have to be practical and realistic in our approach in saying that the long-term goal could be a country or a world that doesn't have prisons that currently exist as how we see them now. But I do think there has to be a place where we could do, my wife sort of calls it social distancing. She talks about, like, we do need places where people can social distance and really sort of like reflect on like things or whatever it is that they did to be rehabilitated. But I think, to your point, Jenny, and what I try to do and how I look at leaders as people who can bring people together. And I think what's important is that, I'm gonna go back to this again, this us against them mentality has not worked for us. And so I'm willing to sit down, because I do think on the spectrum of a reformist and abolitionist, I sit in the middle somewhere. But I'm also because I've been incarcerated, I've seen the inhumane conditions that prison creates, and it's not about rehabilitation. In most of the institutions where I served my time, it was about warehousing individuals. And in fact, every year, programs were being removed from the system. And so now we're just housing people, which to me makes no sense at all. So I do think that we do have to push past the emotional sort of rhetoric of I'm this and I don't want to hear anything else. Like, we do have to sit down and listen, and then also acknowledge the harm. I'm gonna continue to say this, like the war on drugs was a complete failure. And I think we have to acknowledge that and then accept responsibility of the consequences of that decision to declare a war on drugs. What did it do? What did it do to our communities? But I do think that acknowledging the harm that's been done is a start. And then we have to be willing to sit and listen as to, like, what is the world we want to create? And what do we need in the short term to help keep the community safe? But also, how do we build towards this world where prisons don't exist? And we think more about restoration and reconciliation.
This is to both of my colleagues here have done a very good job of walking us through this, but I'll just give you my perspective is, like, I looked at my job as trying to put myself out of business. I believe in aspects of abolition, but I believe there's some people that I would not want to see in the community, and it's a very, very, very small percentage. I think our systems only know one way of the use of incapacitation or incarceration, and that's a 7-day a week, 365 days a year, 24-hour endeavor. I think that we have to kind of reinvent what we want justice to look like in our country, right? So maybe there are circumstances where justice may need to be applied, and you don't have to impact the family of the individual who's going through that journey in the justice system, or the children for that matter, and specifically. And maybe there are different ways that we could apply justice through the use of an open prison concept, that maybe we don't necessarily have to, if we're dealing with somebody who's dealing with some type of substance abuse disease and it's attributed to why they're in the justice system, but they're employable, or they have some skill sets that are capable to sustain themselves in the community. Maybe we set up a system that allows correctional entities to be able to, hey, we're going to run this open prison concept, and you're going to be able to go to work and school, but at night we're going to come back and we're going to program you up. And there's still some semblance of accountability there. And I think that we kind of got to get out of our own way and kind of open up to different ideas as to how we can address the needs of the people who enter the justice system.
I think if, as we continue to work towards a more versatile system that recognizes that we need to do a better job of delivering what each person needs to them to help them, go forward differently and to help repair them, not further damage or traumatize them, we have to be thoughtful about the conditions they're living in right now, the circumstances of their life in a facility, right here. And it takes a lot of juggling. And the more unified we can be, which doesn't mean everybody's always going to agree, but at least in recognizing that there are both immediate and long-term needs and changes that have to be considered and fought for. I think we stand a better chance of getting to some of the outcomes we've all talked about this evening. So that concludes our panel conversation for this evening. I want to thank Scott Semple, Kathy Bankhead, and Marlon Chamberlain for joining the John Howard Association this evening. I really appreciate all of your expertise and experience and your sharing all of that and your thoughts and insights with us this evening. Thank you all. Be healthy, be safe, be well. And that concludes our event for this evening. Thank you to all of our speakers and panelists. And I want to thank everyone for attending and sponsoring tonight's event. JHA's work is made possible by your support. I hope everyone will consider making a donation this evening to allow us to continue providing independent oversight of Illinois prisons for at least another 120 years. If you take one thing away from this event and tonight's speakers, I hope it's that it's important for us to recognize and prevent not just the traumas that happen inside prisons that make media headlines, or the horrible things that get litigated, the quality of healthcare in prisons, but it's the small everyday actions and comments that are visited upon people in prison that erode their sense of self and their self-confidence. It's the chipping away of their humanity bit by bit that Oversight seeks to shine a light on and stop in its tracks. The system is broken, not just the prison system or criminal legal system. Our social mechanisms for support, equity, and opportunity are overwhelmed, underfunded, and dysfunctional. Is the ravages of these multiple system failures that feeds our prisons and jails. John Howard Association is a small, independent prison watchdog group. We understand that too often the people we meet in prison are there because every social safety net meant to catch them and provide help is broken. And then once they hit the bottom and we think that things cannot get worse, they do. Whether it's overt cruelty or the constant catch-22 of dystopian rules and regulations that exclude people from opportunities and programs, or the mean-spirited, unfair, and constant message that what you've done represents who you are. The punishment of prison doesn't end with the denial of liberty. It multiplies due to the treatment people receive, the conditions they live in, and the traumatic experiences they endure. It is this reality that prison oversight seeks to expose and eradicate. It's the fundamental belief that no one is their one worst act, and that everyone, no matter who they are or what they've done, deserves to be treated with humanity that keeps JHA going inside of prisons to be the eyes and ears of the public and fighting for the dignity and fair treatment of all people. Prison oversight can do many things: change policy and practice, advocate for improved conditions and treatment, and increase the transparency of a rather opaque system. The most important aspect of the work, the most fundamental reason to ensure that for as long as people are held in closed systems, groups like JHA go in to monitor them, is because oversight stands for the principle that recognizing the humanity of all of our fellow citizens, especially those who are incarcerated, is a most fundamental responsibility that we have to each other. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Be healthy and be safe.
you.